Hi there, this is Valentine and welcome to another Postman tutorial. Today I wanted to talk about the Postman Snippets. Postman Snippets is this kind of a hidden functionality in Postman that allows you to easily write scripts, and you can easily set variables or write your tests with them, and they're particularly useful if you're just getting started with Postman, you're just getting started with API testing. So today I wanted to go over the entire collection of Postman snippets that are available, and I will explain them to you step by step. Before I get started, I just want to tell you that these snippets, I'm presenting them as they are in the current Postman version that I'm running. So if I'm looking here at the Postman version, you'll see that I am using version 7. So it is possible that in other versions of Postman, this may look a bit different, especially in the future. Things may change, so make sure that you have the same Postman version in case you're relying on this tutorial. The Postman snippets can be accessed anytime you have a request. So you can see the request here, you don't even have to input a URL. And whenever you go to the pre-request script or to the tests, you will see here on the right hand side this panel with the test scripts. You can easily hide it in case you don't want to see it, or you can open it in case you don't see it from here. And here you'll find a list of snippets, a lot of snippets. Practically, we're talking here about 3 types of snippets. So you'll have a lot of snippets that deal with variables. Then we'll have snippets that deal with testing and assertions generally. And finally, there are some generic snippets that can help us along. I would like to start first with the variable snippets. And just in case you are not familiar, Postman has different types of variables. There are environment variables, there are global variables, there are collection variables, and there are, of course, also local variables. So many variable types here. Nothing to worry about. So for example, if you want to set a global variable, you can use this snippet set a global variable. So we're going to set here, for example, a global variable called foo, and we're going to set here the value bar. So let's make here this request go to http://get or anything. That will work as well. So we're going to submit this request. The code will get executed. And if we click here on this part of the screen where we can inspect variables, we should be able to see now that we have this global variable that we have set here. So exactly the name and the value that we have used. Environment variables work pretty much the same. You just have to define an environment. Currently, I don't have an environment. I don't want to get too much into that. Just going to show you like one example for the variable so that you can understand what we're talking about. Now, when it comes to getting a variable, pretty much the same thing. So you use here get a global variable, and we're going to use this key, which is foo. So this is the foo. It can be anything else. So we're going to simply log it to the console to see that it's working. I'm going to open here the Postman console. So when I submit this, we'll be able to see here that the value bar has been received. So exactly what we have set here. If we make here a change, for example, we use the variable, rename it in name Jane, and we're getting the name, maybe call it first name to make it even simpler here. So if we're using this, submitting the request, we'll see we get here Jane. Now in this case, when working with variables, it's important that you understand how the method, how the function here should look like. So for example, set is using 2 parameters. If I'm using here get and providing 2 parameters, this will not work. So for example, if I'm deleting this variable here, so let's go and edit and remove everything that we have. If I'm trying to use get to actually set a variable, this will not work. So I'm going to get here undefined because first name has not been defined. So this is why using these snippets in this case makes a lot of sense. It really helps you avoid making obvious mistakes. One thing to note about these snippets when it comes to variables, in Postman there are also collection variables, and unfortunately the snippets have not been updated to reflect that you can also use collection variables. I will post in the video description a link to the Postman quick reference guide and also to the official Postman documentation, all the methods that are available and that you can use to work with this kind of variables. So don't worry about it. If you don't find it here, it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. So now practically we kind of covered the variables. So there you get a variable. This is getting a local variable or getting a variable that is within the scope. Let me quickly exemplify what I mean by that. For example, here we can define a global variable. I'm going to manually define it. City, and the current value is New York. So if I'm trying to get this variable, let's use here console log to log the value. I still have to specify city as a key. Now you will see that it will get this variable independent of the scope, which means that I can have here a global variable, I can have here an environment variable, I can have a collection variable. It will work pretty much the same. Just need to pay attention to the scope because one, for example, the environment variable will override the global variable and so on. Again, don't want to get too much into variables. Just want to point out this additional use case here. Now moving on, set an environment variable, set a global variable, pretty similar in functionality, nothing special there. Clear an environment variable just allows you to practically delete the value that has been set. Clear a global variable, pretty much the same. Make sure that you don't confuse clearing. So clearing simply means unsetting. If you actually use, instead of unset, you use clear. Still specify a value. Something weird will happen. So let me execute this once. You'll see here, there's no error, no indication that something went wrong. I tried to clear a variable underscore key, so this shouldn't exist. But as you will see, I've deleted all my variables, all my global variables. So that's another reason why it is a good idea when you're trying to do something that you don't rely on memory. You would think that pm.global.clear, the specifier parameter, would delete only this variable. You use the wrong thing. So just as a comparison, clear is not the same as unset. Typically you want to use unset, you don't want to use clear, because in this case clear will have consequences that you don't really want to see there. This is an overview of what you can do with variables. And in the second part, I'm going to move towards creating tests, again using these snippets. Now, especially if you're getting started with tests, it's a super easy way to write some basic tests in Postman without worrying too much about what's going on behind the scenes, worrying too much about JavaScript, and especially worrying about making any mistakes. The most simple test that you can write is status code is 200. So it's a test that's easy to understand. It automatically gets here displayed in the test results, and you can easily tell right from the beginning if the request overall has been successful. Now, probably the second thing that you might be interested in is this JSON value check. So most of the time, as I see here in the body, in this response from http://bin.org, is just an API that's sending back the data that we have already sent towards them. I'm getting here a JSON response body, and most APIs will work with JSON. So this code snippet is one of the most important code snippets that you will be using. So for example, if I want to test here something, I want to test, for example, that method from this response. So was get. I can simply easily adapt this snippet, and you will see here that I have the test result there. So what this snippet does is, first of all, it will parse the response. Just 1 second, here is it. So it will parse the response. The response is just a text, but because it's encoded as JSON, it will transform it into a JavaScript object. And based on that JavaScript object, we can start making some assertions. From all the test snippets that you will see here, these are probably one of the most important ones. It really makes your life easier, and you should know them by heart. When it comes to the response body containing a string, this is another one that you will see here. This is particularly useful, especially if your response is not in JSON. So I wouldn't search for example, search for get here, because I'm not sure exactly where I'm going to find it. So the test may pass. I can even test like the entire response or search for specific information, but I don't want to get too much into that. I don't want to worry about maybe there's a duplicate, maybe I'm searching for get and there's another get somewhere. So don't use this unless your response is not formatted either in XML or JSON or any format that you can easily parse. Pretty much the same goes with request body is equal to a string. So practically you're going to take the entire request body and say that it equals a respective string. So this will make sense if you have like something short like OK or success. That's again not in JSON. But if you have like this massive response, it doesn't really make sense to get in Postman and to put like this entire response that you see here in your tests and assert against that. Doesn't really make a lot of sense, only for very, very short responses that are not marked as JSON. So this is when it comes to, you see all of them are marked with response body, response body, response body. So it makes it a bit easier to figure out which one is which. And then we also can do things on the response headers. Now you can see that we are making a lot of assertions on the response because this is what we are interested in. This is the part that we don't know. We have sent a request, so we kind of know what's in the request, but we're interested in what's coming back from the server. This is why we make all the assertions on the response. Again, we're looking here at headers, so we can check for headers if the specific header exists. So you see in this case, there is a header content type. We can easily check, is this header yet there? Yes, the test is passing. If I add here something like X type, does it exist? It doesn't exist. You can see here in the headers, so the test will fail. So pretty easy to understand what that is doing. There's also a possibility of kind of checking how fast your API was, in the sense that you'll be able to tell, to specify your response time. So this will be like a maximum response time, so it should be under 200 milliseconds. You'll see here in this case, this is responding in 119. I don't like to use Postman for this kind of performance tests. The reason for that is it's not really good for that. Sometimes there are some small delays, and you don't want to abuse this tool for anything else but API testing. So if you want to make sure that your responses are generally very fast, maybe this is not the best tool. If you mix normal API tests that test like the functionality of the API with this kind of, say, performance related test, this may fail from time to time, and you'll have like a lot of, if you're running the collection all the time in your continuous integration server, nothing may change in the API, but you may still get from time to time like failures because of the infrastructure where the API is running, or maybe there are some underlying dependencies. So really be very careful if you want to add something like this, because it will generate problems in the future. Going back a bit to the status code, this is just another way of expressing something. So the post request may return different status codes. It may return a 201 or 202. Sometimes it may return even only a 200. So just in case multiple status codes are okay for you, you can use this kind of a syntax to be one of. An example here is for a successful post request. Typically, I never used it, but just in case you need to test against multiple status codes and either of them is valid, that's a good way how you can write a test like this. Also, less popular or less useful is to actually test for the status code name. So if you see, for example, here in this API, the status is 200 OK. It will gonna test for the OK. So in this case, if I'm sending this as it is, it's gonna say that create is not OK. So if I write here OK, in that case, the test again will pass. It is an alternative way if you're working with a lot of status codes and you just want to make sure that you also understand, or you also test for the status code and also for the text that's in the status code, you can use that. Personally, I find it rather not so useful when it comes to API testing, at least for the use cases that I'm dealing with, but it's always good to know that it's there. Finally, going into the response body, you see that here is not pretty organized. So the response body again is coming right here. And this is when you're dealing with an XML response body. And the idea is pretty much the same as when you're parsing a JSON value. You'll see here in the JSON value, you're using pm.response.json to parse that information. If you're dealing with XML, you will use this XML to JSON, and you'll have this special Postman variable response body. Both of them work pretty much the same. So you can, if you're asserting something on an XML object, and I also did a tutorial on that, you can check here in the video description and in the notification. It's a bit harder to make assertions on XML objects because they're a bit more complicated. But the idea is pretty much the same. You have here the object, and then you have different properties, and you can make assertions on them. It's just an alternative. It's just a counterpart for JSON. Right, so if looking here, we pretty much have covered everything. There are still a few things that I wanted to go into. So I mentioned that the snippets handle variables, can help you write tests, but it can also finally help you write some other kind of scripts. These other kind of scripts, for example, is when you need to submit a request. So you can go here and click send a request, and this script will actually be executed inside the code. So you're sending this main request, let's say, and when the response comes back in the tests, then this code will be executed. And this may be helpful if you need to check something in your scripts to verify that some information came back. Now, be very careful with using send requests for building really complex requests. Things get complicated. Getting complex requests to work here require a bit of JavaScript know-how. So I typically do not recommend that you use this. You can easily chain multiple regular Postman requests with one another, use variables, and simply use this intuitive interface of building your request instead of working here in your code editor, trying to figure out how to do a complex post request with some data and some headers and so on. I honestly think that Postman does a better job at simply using here the UI to build the request as you need it. You chain it with other requests, and you can just, if you need to move some assertions somewhere else, you can move them there. Don't overuse PM send request. From my point of view, it's a bit overrated in terms of why you would want to use it inside requests and tests. We almost went through all the snippets. I kind of left this one almost for the end part. And this is a tiny validator for JSON schema. Tiny validator is a library that's included in Postman and allows you to verify the structure of your schema, of your response practically, so that you see not only verifying some individual properties to see which value they have, but you can define a schema that tells you if the data structure itself is the proper one. I did a tutorial on how to do schema validation that you'll see a notification here right on top. The main idea here is that I don't like tiny validator. It doesn't give you really good errors in case something fails, or sometimes doesn't fail at all if you make a small mistake in your schema. So for that reason, I sort of consider the tiny validator to be outdated or a bit deprecated. And Postman has a different way of better handling the schema validation. So if you ask me, just don't use this here. It will not do you any good. Watch the tutorial that I mentioned previously, and I will explain to you what you need to do there. You've seen we went now through almost all the snippets here, and we kind of have like an overview of what's going on. I also wanted to point out that you see the snippets also in the pre-request script. Now here in the pre-request script, there are only a few snippets that are available, pretty much the snippets that we already discussed. The main difference with the pre-request script is that this script will be executed before the request is sent. So before, in this case, http://bin.org is being called, I can still do some things in the pre-request script, including, for example, sending other requests with using this send request that I mentioned before, but also setting global variables. So for example, I can set a global variable, name, Jake. And if I go, for example, here, let's say using this form data, name Jake, oops, not name Jake, and I'm using the variable. So the name is name, the name of the variable is name, great name. It will say here that it's unresolved, but I will show you in a second what's going on. So I'm sending this out, and you will see here that the form has sent this variable. So it's a nice way to prepare some data for your request, and the snippets can help you especially deal with variables. Now, unfortunately, the impression that this snippets give in this case is that you can do only a few limited things in the pre-request scripts, and that is not true. You can practically do almost everything that you have seen here in this part. You can even write tests. Of course, you will not have the response body available because the request has not been sent yet. So it doesn't make sense to have that, but you can still write tests here. There's nothing stopping you from doing that. So just wanted to point out that you don't have to worry too much about the kind of snippets that you find here. There's many more things that are available here, including the request object that you can still manipulate. Unfortunately, there's no snippet for that. And just overall, there are no snippets that you can import. And at this point, we have absolutely no control over what kind of snippets are here. So you cannot go ahead and define your own snippets or import other snippets or anything like that. They come with the application. We have to use them as they are. And if you don't like them, or if you want to do more advanced stuff, as I mentioned in the video description, you will find the complete reference to all the scripts that you can do in Postman. It's a good step if you have already gained a bit more experience. Otherwise, if you're just getting started with Postman, I'm sure that in 90% of the cases, you will find what you need here. And it is much safer if you rely on one of the snippets here to set variables, to write some basic tests. I've seen a lot of people making mistakes when they start writing code on their own and they are not experienced with JavaScript. So for that reason, I highly recommend that you stick with the snippets for the beginning, and after that you can learn more and not be so dependent on them. That's it when it comes to snippets.